Hello and welcome everyone to this evening's webinar, Racial Trauma and Mental Health. My name is Liv Alanis Myers, my pronouns are they, and I am the Outreach and Communications Manager for the Office of Human Rights and Equity. The office exists to eradicate discrimination, increase equal opportunity, and protect and promote human rights in Howard County. While it might be the end of Minority Mental Health Month that ran for the month of July, we are here to remind you that minority mental health, or BIPOC mental health in this case, doesn't stop mattering just because the monthly observance is over. So, to talk more about this subject, we have invited a very special guest. Please welcome Octavia Brown, LCSW-C, the owner and clinical director of the Urban Institute of Mental Health.
Hello. How are you?
Hello. Octavia, would you briefly introduce yourself and the work that you do, please?
Absolutely. And I first just I'm really grateful and so thankful to be here. I want to thank you, Liv, and the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity for all of the work that you do. I'm honored to be here and honored that you asked me to be here. As Liv said, my name is Octavia Brown. I am a licensed clinical social worker and I am the owner and clinical director of the Urban Institute of Mental Health. We do a lot of great things, but to try to put it as briefly as possible, we work to bridge the division between effective mental health services and the BIPOC community, which stands for the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, the LGBTQIA plus community, and all other marginalized populations. We recognize that the way that most clinicians have been trained to do this work is not always effective in different communities of different cultural backgrounds, different identities, and different cultural backgrounds. And so we have worked relentlessly at not only acknowledging how systemic oppression affects these communities, their mental health, their behavioral health, the way that they exist, the way that they see themselves in this world, and most specifically in this country. But we work hard to put effective interventions in place to meet the need and bridge that gap between ineffective mental health services or mental health being stigmatized and the lack of care being received from these communities. And so that's what I do. That's what we do here at the Urban Institute. In short.
Beautiful. And tonight's webinar is focusing on racial trauma and mental health. And when we reached out to you, you were so excited to talk about this topic. Can you give us a bit of a background of why you're so passionate about this?
I always tell the story of when I was a little girl and my grandmother, who was very, I grew up in a very Afrocentric household. I recognize that was a privilege, for me growing up because as when we go into the effects of racial trauma and the history of and like slavery in this country, one of the big things that I will talk about is the eradication of your identity, and especially your connection to your cultural roots. I was very fortunate enough to have a grandmother who made sure we knew our identity, we knew our history, and we were very connected to our ancestral roots. And she started very early, and she had this almost like rites of passage. When you got to a certain age, she would sit you down and show you Roots, which is written by Alex Haley. And it for most people, I'm sure, have heard of Roots. And it depicts a man's journey, a young man's journey, Kunta Kinte, from being taken, stolen from his homeland in the Gambia and taken here through the Middle Passage and enslaved, and what that was like for him. And ever since I saw that, I think a fire like kind of like sparked in me. And from that time, I have dedicated my entire career, my academia, the work that I do, to uplifting and empowering and liberating the minds of Black and Brown people. And so I have a lot of passion behind this. It brings me such joy to talk about, and especially because it's being talked about, So I get excited whenever, and I'm always ready for when somebody wants to hear about racial trauma and the effects of racial trauma on us mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally.
Okay, well, wonderful. What a great transition. So Octavia is going to do a presentation on this topic. And then as always, if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. So Octavia, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. All righty. So once again, I'm grateful to be here. I am going to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to me, which is racial trauma and mental health. Just like I mentioned before, I have spent a lot of time um, engaging in research under mentorship, studying under different Black or Brown scholars, clinicians that was able to impact the work that I do, and be able to help render effective solutions to the consequences of racial trauma on the people who unfortunately fall victim to it. And so I do want to throw a disclaimer out, and I want to take the time to recognize, number one, first and foremost, that systemic oppression affects a lot of different identities. So I do want to honor the BIPOC community, that those are Black, indigenous people to this land, and other people of color. I want to honor the LGBTQIA plus community. I want to honor all other marginalized identities, those who might have a disability, those who may be neurodivergent. I want to honor all of those communities, and let you know that while I am going to focus most specifically on Black Americans and those Black Americans who are descendants of slavery, that we have not forgotten you, and we are not dismissing the experience you have living under systemic oppression. And in a little bit, you'll see a slide kind of how all of that intersects, all of the different, systems of oppression in this country. But we do want to honor you. But for purposes of this specific topic, I'm just going to focus on Black Americans and those specifically who are descendants of slavery. So we are going to talk today, not just about racial trauma and mental health, but the impact of current and historic trauma on mental health and wellness. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right. So when I start any presentation or speaking on anything, I like to give a quote that is powerful, and give you a minute just to sit and let it resonate with you, let it penetrate, let those words penetrate, and really ask yourself and reflect, like, what does this mean to me? And today's quote comes from Resma, Manicum, and it comes from the book My Grandmother's Hands. We do have it here, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. The quote is very powerful, and it absolutely not only influences my work, but really gives a deeper perspective and deeper insight into what we're going to talk about today, which in essence is trauma, right? So it says trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualized over time looks like culture. This is so deep. And I do hope that, you allow yourself to sit with it. Ask yourself, what do I resonate with in the words that he spoke, in the words that he wrote? What does that look like to me? How has my own individual trauma been masked as my actual personality, right? When we experience trauma as an individual from an individual level, and we'll get into what trauma is, we can begin to mistake the consequences of that trauma or symptoms of trauma as who we are as a person, right? Same thing in the family context, right? When there is intergenerational family trauma that has occurred from generation to generation, we begin to mistake that for the consequences of that trauma, the symptoms of that trauma, for family traits or the culture of our family, right? And when we look at trauma decontextualized over time for an entire group of people, we can begin to mistake the consequences and the symptoms of that trauma for our actual culture. And so I think my hope is that by the time I get to the end of this presentation, that you will completely understand what Resma was saying, and what he was trying to imply here, and how that resonates with you. All right, next slide. Okay, I am a Okay. I am a mental health professional. I am a clinical social worker. And I thought it would be really good to hear from other mental health professionals who are, um, two are people of color. One, Dr. Rosenberg, is not a person of color, but it is important to recognize from a mental health perspective, and for those who are actually behind the scenes and treating these illnesses and seeing, like on the front lines, seeing how racial trauma affects the people that they serve, what they have to say, right? And so I'm just going to briefly go over just a couple of really powerful quotes from work that each one of these individuals have completed and have done. So Dr. Rita Walker, and she wrote the book, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. She, and I quote, wrote in the book, "For anyone to assume that psychology is the same, regardless of race, is to operate from a place of privilege." Natalie Gutierrez, who wrote the book, The Pain We Carry, she is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She says, "We are people living in Black and brown skin, feeling unsafe to be ourselves. Many of our empowering and peaceful ancestral practices have been colonized and demonized." This is powerful because when you go to school, as a person who wants to operate from a place of a healer perspective, who wants to step in and intervene, who wants to guide people to healing, what you're taught, how you're taught to render therapy, and clinical services, is not from an Indigenous perspective, right? Our ancestral practices, the ones that our ancestors used prior to colonization, have been deemed either unhealthy or that they don't work or demonized, right? And so we're not taught to use, and a lot of us are even afraid, if we want to in our own practice, include these practices when we're working with people of color. And last but not least, Kenneth Rosenberg, Black people are more likely to get care from non-Black providers, which can lead to miscommunication, inaccurate diagnosis, and subpar care. Research shows that mental health professionals are more likely to see a person of color as sicker than a white person. With the same clinical presentation, providers are more than likely to view a person of color as having a poor prognosis, needing a higher doses of medicine, and being more dangerous and belonging in jail as opposed to a hospital. And so while we know that racial trauma impacts the BIPOC community on a like it impacts their mental health and mental well-being and their behavioral health and their emotional well-being. But even when we are brave enough to seek treatment, there's often systemic oppression, discriminatory practices that we have to face when we actually do go and try to get treatment for the very, racial issues, the systemic oppression that has caused us to have these issues in the first place. And so I wanted to make sure that it is understood what people of color are up against when they're even trying to seek healing. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I thought it to be very important before we go into racial trauma and death to understand what trauma is to begin with. And what I did was to take a very powerful, because there's so many different definitions of trauma. There's so many different professionals who have taken the research and what they've learned and what they've seen and kind of created their own definition of trauma. But one of the most powerful definitions of trauma that I have read has been from Dr. Joy DeGruy. It comes from her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And so I'm going to use this definition of trauma to talk about what trauma is overall outside of, specifically racial trauma. And so what she says is that trauma is an injury caused by an outside, usually violent force, event, or experience. We can experience this injury physically, emotionally, psychologically, and or spiritually. And I want to kind of pause there for a second because the depth of what she just said, we can experience this injury physically, emotionally, psychologically, and or spiritually. What she is saying that is trauma impacts every aspect of your being. It impacts every aspect of your being. Right? And it says traumas can upset our equilibrium and our well-being. And if a trauma is severe enough, it can distort our attitudes and our beliefs. Such distortions often result in dysfunctional behaviors, which can in turn produce unwanted consequences. She then goes on to say, since even one traumatic experience can result in distorted attitudes, dysfunctional behaviors, and unwanted consequences, this pattern is magnified exponentially when a person repeatedly experiences severe trauma, and is much worse when the trauma is caused by human beings. I have been engaging in trauma work for a very long time. And what I've come to understand is it's not necessarily what happened, right? A lot of times we want to put a big emphasis on exactly what the situation, what the incident, what the experience was, what actually happened, right? And we want to gauge, okay, well, if the experience is severe enough, according to someone else's perspective, right? Then we can say it's trauma. But because I've done this work for such a long time, I've really begun to realize, no, that's not necessarily the case, right? It's not necessarily about what happens. It's about what happened and how that circumstance or that incident or that experience impacted the person. And that's going to look different for each and every individual, right? There could be a circumstance or an incident that someone else might deem as minute or not that serious that might have a tremendous impact on the individual who experienced it, right? And so when we look at the way that trauma affects human beings, when I'm looking and assessing in my clients whether or not this person is impacted by trauma or by the experiences that they have had, I am looking for the impact on their entire being. How does it impact them physically, emotionally, psychologically, and or spiritually? And most importantly, I'm examining how did that trauma impact the way that the body regulates itself and the way that we perceive ourselves and the rest of the world, right? And when she goes in and she says that really you only need one traumatic event to disrupt your entire equilibrium and well-being, right? And it can be vicarious. You don't even necessarily have to experience it firsthand. But can you imagine how severe the trauma is and how severe the effects of that trauma when it is chronic trauma, when it is complex trauma, when it is something that has been repeated over and over again? Whether it's different traumatic situations or whether it's the same traumatic situation for an extended period of time, right? And I think I love this definition because it really gives a broader context into just how much trauma can impact not just the person, but that person's people around them, the people, the village that are around them, their family members, their friends, their children, their children's children, generations after, and an entire community of people. You can do the next slide. So now that we've looked at what trauma is overall, right? Let's look at racial trauma, right? And racial trauma are trauma symptoms or responses that result from experienced and or exposure to racism, racial bias, discrimination, prejudice, and hate crime, right? And I think one of the most important things to understand, and one of the things that I tell my clients, you don't have to justify whether or not you've experienced this, right? We know for a fact that these systems of oppression exist. They're real. They're out there. They've been a system that's been in place for a very, very long time. These systems have been built into the foundation of this country, the creation of this country, to justify slavery in the first place. So you never have to question, oh, was I tripping? Well, did that person, even if this is something that you felt that you experienced, it constitutes racial trauma, right? And some examples of exposure to racial trauma are microaggressions, overt racism, such as police harassment and profiling, wrongful arrests and mass incarceration, actual and or threatened deportation, hate comments and slurs, medical discriminatory experiences and practices, media coverage of overt racism and discrimination, etc. And just to look at some common reactions, you're going to experience, it's very likely that you can experience anger, frustration, aggression, hypervigilance, right? You're always kind of like watching, for your safety, you're having to be super aware of any potential threats that might be, out there. And we can't even call it paranoia because the threat is very real. As we've just seen with Sonia Massey, who lost her life while asking for help by a group of individuals who are employed and trained to protect her, right? And so insomnia, withdrawal or isolation from others, somatic complaints, anxiety, depression, lack of productivity, motivation, helplessness, hopelessness, inappropriate guilt. These are all very common reactions to racial trauma. Next slide. And in order to really understand how all this comes into play, we have to understand the systems of oppression and marginalization in this country, right? This is a chart that I put together based off of my own research, my own practice. I have been doing this work for a very long time. I have engaged in research for a very long time. And this topic can be kind of controversial because there's a lot of arguments about what came first. Did colonialism or imperialism come first, or did capitalism come first? Or, how did each one impact the other, and how each one got into, where it is? And so my theory, because I study the minds of people, I study what drives their behavior, right? My theory is that capitalism, even though it might not have been an actual sustained system, but the idea of it is what drove colonialism and imperialism, excuse me. And so when we think about systems of oppression and the mentality and the mindset and the beliefs behind it, capitalism has to be at the top, right? Because it's what's driving colonialism and imperialism, which then drives white supremacy and racism, patriarchy and sexism, ableism, classism, heterosexism, homophobia, ageism, xenophobia, transphobia, sizeism. So there's a lot of marginalized identities here, a lot of systems of oppression here, right? And it's important to understand how we are all impacted by these systems, right? And so just like I said earlier, even though a good majority of this training or this topic of conversation is going to be focused on the Black community, the Black American community, and most specifically those who are descendants of slavery, just for context and better understanding of what I'm trying to teach here, there are a lot of us, a good majority of us, in some way, shape, or form have at least one marginalized identity, right? And it's important to understand how that came into play. Okay, next slide. Okay, now with all of that being said, and now that you have the understanding of what trauma is, what racial trauma is, how all of these things came into play in the first place. Like, how does racial trauma even exist in the first place? Which we looked at, the systems of oppression, and starting off with capitalism kind of being at the top. It's important now to understand the trauma layers of individuals who are Black Americans, really of the BIPOC community as a whole. But like I said, specifically for this conversation, we're going to look specifically at Black Americans who are descendants of those who are enslaved, right? And so there are three major layers of trauma. You have your individual trauma, and this is what you have personally experienced, right? Once you were born and you have physical existence, this is what you have personally experienced. Some examples of that are physical and sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, serious medical conditions, natural disasters, abandonment, grief, loss, accident, or your own firsthand encounters with overt racism, discrimination, being mistreated, microaggressions. All of those things can fall under individual trauma, right? And then the next layer, so we've already got to experience this. And we know that there are a high number of individuals who are going to experience trauma. My theory is that everyone at some point of time probably experiences trauma, right? I remember being in graduate school, and they talked about the percentage of children who experienced an adverse childhood event. They call it the ACEs and the ACEs score. I was learning about that. And they said that 80% of individuals who they surveyed had acknowledged to experiencing an adverse childhood experience, right? And I think there could be some limitations to that research as to why there weren't more, but let's acknowledge that there's already extremely high number of individuals that don't even make it to adulthood without experiencing trauma, right? So you've got that you have to deal with, and that's been affecting. When we look at Dr. DeGruy's definition of trauma, that's already impacting your being, right? And then there's intergenerational family trauma. This is trauma that you were born into. And we know that this affects you even on a biological level, because the study of epigenetics, which is scientific studies that research and study how the outside environment and what individuals experience in society or whatever they experience that's outside of the body, how that actually impacts your biological makeup. And what we have learned from the study of epigenetics is that a mother can indeed pass trauma down to her child, her unborn child, genetically, because the outside situations, the outside experiences and incidents actually can change the genetic sequences and DNA and the way our genes express themselves, right? And then that can then be biologically passed down to our children. And so you have some examples of intergenerational family trauma: deportation, incarceration, chronic illness, undiagnosed, untreated mental illness, chronic poverty, substance abuse, grief and loss, religious trauma, alcoholism. These are just some examples of intergenerational family trauma. And then we go and we look at an ancestral level, right? And this means that, this is experiences that have been perpetrated on our ancestors hundreds of years ago. And this is under systemic and historical trauma, right? And as you can see, there are a lot of different types of historical trauma, right? We have had, for an example, Christopher Columbus, and colonization to begin with. When you're thinking about the indigenous people of this land, who were already inhabiting this land and already had, this was their land, and then had to experience colonization, right? The Indian boarding schools, Japanese intermittent camps, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Spanish American War, terrorism, of course, antebellum slavery, and that's what we're gonna, talk a lot about. But things that our ancestors experienced that disrupted their identity, sense of well-being, their equilibrium, changed and distorted the way that they saw themselves, the way that they see the world, still impacts us to this day, hundreds of years later, even after the event has ended. We're going to focus, for purposes of this conversation, on antebellum slavery. And so I'm going to actually read from Dr. Joy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And I'm going to read kind of the way that she described the enslavement experience. And then we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the enslavement experience. So she says, the enslavement experience was one of continual violent attacks on body, mind, and spirit. Continued. So this was chronic. Men, women, and children were traumatized throughout their lives, and the violent attacks during slavery persisted long after emancipation. In the face of these injuries, those traumatized adapted their attitudes and behaviors in order to simply survive. And these adaptations continue to manifest today. What I think she beautifully did was to really give you an understanding as to how, even today, hundreds of years later, after the emancipation, although there were several different systems and laws and codes and rules to continually oppress Black people, even after the emancipation, but how just from slavery alone, right, just from the enslavement experience alone, we are still impacted mentally, emotionally, behaviorally, spiritually, psychologically, hundreds of years later. And what she expresses is that our ancestors had to adapt a survival mentality in order to survive, right? And it is that same survival mentality that the descendants of those who were enslaved have today, presently. In the book, she calls every person born in a Black body slavery's children. And that really, really describes the impact of slavery on Black Americans even to this day. So she actually takes slavery and puts it under intergenerational family trauma to say that we are the actual children of that historic period of time, the antebellum slave period. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So most importantly, for purposes of what we're here to talk about, is how slavery impacted those who are the descendants of the enslaved, right? What are the consequences of that type of racial trauma? Not only slavery, right? But what are the consequences of continued systemic oppression because of the color of your skin, right? When you are living in a Black body. How does that impact you as a whole, right? And I think the most important thing to understand and break down is to have a good understanding of the three parts of self, the three parts of a human individual, right? There are three parts of yourself. You have the body, the mind, and the spirit, right? Our Each one has a very specific purpose. Each one has its own kind of separate identity, really, but all work together as one. So whatever is done to one, or whatever impacts one part of yourself, is going to ultimately affect all parts of self, right? And so when we look at the what the purpose of the body is, really the purpose of despite how we have been conditioned to believe, it's not for beauty. It's not, for whatever society has indoctrinated us to believe that it's for, as far as beauty standards and what weight it should be and things like that. The body is literally the outer expression, right, of your inner spirit and your inner mind, right? It is the part of you that protects the inner mind and the inner spirit. It is of the part of you that allows you to have a physical expression and physically express the desires of the mind and the spirit. The spirit is synonymous with your true identity, who you truly are, your authentic self, your higher sense of self. Um, the mind is where our beliefs, our values, reasoning, our thought processes, all of those things happen in the mind. And the mind is what was most impacted when the antebellum slavery period was occurring. And so I want to paint a picture for you, to really begin to help you to understand what really happened mentally, physically, spiritually during the antebellum slavery period. Right. And I talked about, when I was asked earlier, why am I so passionate about what I do? And I brought up roots. Right. And I think roots is a great, we're going to use Kunta Kinte as kind of like a case study. It's a great opportunity to give you an overall understanding of what happened during that enslavement period, right? So you have Kunta Kinte, who is very rooted in his own cultural beliefs, his own cultural identity. He knew who he was. He stood firm in who he was. He knew what his place in life was, what his place in his circle of life was, what his value systems were, what he was expected of him and his tribe, and as a part of his culture, right? And so you see at the beginning of Roots just what life looked like for Kunta Kinte prior to coming to the Americas. And so you see a young man who is learning himself still and stepping into his role. You see him go through the rites of passage to manhood. You see the very concrete cultural practices and experiences, and you see him partake in that, and he's proud. He's very proud of who he is and who he is to come, who he is to become. And then we see him be stolen from his land by those who were participating in the slave trade, and sold into slavery. You see his journey through the Middle Passage. Um, and then we see him arrive in Annapolis. We see him being placed. Now, mind you, he did his best to even make it through the Middle Passage. There were parts where of the show or the movie or the series where you see that he, even during the Middle Passage, it was so degrading what he had to experience. There were bodies on top of bodies, people dying on the ship, and he's noticing all of this. He's seeing all of this. He's existing in all of this, and he even wants to give up, but there was, other family members on the ship who was telling him, no, keep pushing. You see him continually try to fight for his freedom and his liberation, right? And then he comes into Annapolis, and that's where they dock, and he has to stand like a piece of merchandise and be looked over, touched over, have every part of himself be violated in order to see if he's going to be a good purchase, right? And he gets to where he's going. He gets to his first plantation, and you see the attempts to strip everything away from him that has him to exist in his true authentic self, his identity. He's given another name, and he's not allowed to use his rightful name anymore. He's not allowed to engage in his traditional and cultural practices. He's not allowed to take care of himself. All of the work that he does is for the care of someone else. It's for the benefit of someone else. It's for the benefit of the enslaver. And you see him literally be ripped from any and everything that could allow him to be self-sufficient in any way. And he is now completely and 150% dependent on the enslaver for his well-being and his survival. And that reminds me of a child to a parent who is responsible for caring for their needs. They're unable to care for themselves. And we see that in childhood, this is where a lot of trauma happens. We see this is where attachment styles are developed based on how that parent provides or meets the needs of that child. And so we now can symbolically look at the enslaver's relationship between the enslaver and the slave as one of a parent and child, right? And we know that needs are not being met, that the experience is horribly abusive, it's horrific, it is sadistic, right? And one of the most powerful scenes of Root, one that still affects me to this day, it still does something to my soul, my spirit when I watch it. And most of you who have seen it, or if you have not seen it, Kunta Kinte makes several attempts to run, symbolically meaning he refuses to remain enslaved. He is fighting by any means necessary for his own liberation and his freedom. And one of the times that he had run and got caught, he was brought back to the plantation, and he is tied up to a tree. His hands and his feet are tied. He's not able to protect himself in any way, shape, or form. And there is the enslaver and the overseer, and the overseer begins to beat him with a whip. And they're beating him, and they're beating him, and they're beating him. And they're saying, we will not stop beating you until you acknowledge that your name is Toby. And he is fighting to hold on to any bit of identity that he has left. And he says, Kunta Kinte, no, my name is Kunta Kinte. And they whip him, and they whip him some more. And they are beating him, and they're beating him until finally he gives up all hope and allows himself to separate from his true authentic self and who he is truly, his true identity. And he says, my name is Toby. But he only did it because he knew that he would die if he did not. So he's only did it for survival. And that was a perfect depiction of what the descendants of those who were enslaved, what we still experience to this day as a consequence of not just antebellum slavery, but continued systemic oppression against Black bodies. There is a sense of learned and internalized helplessness. There is a belief, a deeply embedded belief that we have no power and control over our lives. There is an internalized self-hatred and bias, right? When you look at the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved, and we look at it symbolically from a parent to a child, and we know that children form trauma bonds with their parents, that we can look at the Black culture and Black Americans, those who are descendants of slavery, and see that there is a trauma bond between the Black community and symbolically the enslaver. We know that the family structure is impacted. There is a book called by Ralph Richard Banks. It's called Is Marriage for White People? And in how the African-American marriage decline affects everyone. And he writes an entire book on all the consequences of racial trauma and slavery and how it impacts the family structure, the entire book, right? There's a lack of self-identity and sense of self. We are still oppressed in the mind, and there was a deep division and inability to effectively unify with one another, all as a result of antebellum slavery and continued racial trauma and oppression. Next slide. Am I going over too late? I hope not. Okay. And so for purposes of time, let's skip this slide because I think I've overtalked. So we'll go to the next one. Solutions and interventions. And from a perspective, from a mental health clinician, clinical social worker, what our job is on this level is to deconstruct and decolonize mental health treatment for, but not specifically with populations with marginalized identities, to strive to guide clients to mental liberation and freedom from systemic oppression. The mind has been oppressed, it's decolonized, it's indoctrinated with all of these beliefs that we have in turn that are so deeply rooted because of ancestral trauma, right? Our job is to uncondition, liberate the minds of Black and Brown people, to drastically increase treatment outcomes of mental health services in the BIPOC community and other marginalized communities by prioritizing self-education and promoting true cultural responsiveness. It is our job and our duty to educate other mental health professionals on how to ethically deliver effective, non-biased, non-discriminatory, anti-racist, culturally appropriate, and competent mental health services to BIPOC communities. It is our job to pioneer research that improves mental health outcomes in BIPOC communities and continues to assist in the development of new treatment interventions. As there are more and more research that comes out that says, hey, these mainstream evidence-based practices are proving now with new research they're not as effective in communities of color. That a lot of us have to add our own spin to cognitive behavioral therapy in order to effectively reach people of color, right? And most importantly, to create a safe space for practitioners of color and for the clients. But most importantly, for practitioners to practice in their true authenticity without judgment or punishment. Next slide. And most importantly, I want to acknowledge the most recent incident of racial trauma that a lot of us have experienced vicariously. I can tell you myself, I experienced vicariously. I made the grave mistake of watching that video from the police footage. And I want to hold space for those individuals who have been affected vicariously through witnessing the murder, the outright murder of a young Black woman who called upon, and not only a young Black woman, but a young Black woman who potentially was experiencing mental health illness, who had called on a system that was created to serve and protect, that continues to reinforce the belief that that system might have been called to serve and protect others, but they were certainly not called to serve and protect us as Black and Brown individuals. And so I want to hold space for her. And I want to say her name and say that we are fighting and praying for justice for Sonia Massey, and to really let it resonate with you when these type of incidents happen, the continued messages that are being communicated non-verbally and even verbally to the Black community. And I think that's it. I think that's my last slide. Well, I think there's one more just for questions. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Octavia. I've gotten some great comments of people going, we're learning so much. I don't even have questions. I'm just taking it in. But we do have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, please drop one in the chat. We have a comment that says, thank you so much for this presentation. I've learned so much. And someone said, as a white person, it's always so good to learn more about the way capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy and white supremacy affect people of color specifically. So After this incredible depth of information, I'm sure that there are still people that would push back on this and say, really, this definition of trauma is too broad. We're putting too many things under this umbrella of trauma. What would be your response to that?
My response, as a person who has learned the power of sitting back and looking at patterns, right? Looking at patterns of behaviors. A person can debate something that's spoken, right? When I'm in the therapy session, anybody can say anything to me in therapy, right? Like, you can say whatever you want. But what I pay attention to is how they express themselves to their behavior, right? And when we look and we can challenge this idea that, oh, it's not that serious, like, racial trauma is, this is just an excuse and da 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 da. But when you can trace back patterns of behavior that has been adopted and adapted specifically for survival hundreds of years ago and see those exact same behaviors being engaged in by the descendants of those ancestors today, there's not a lot you can argue there, right? When I can say that during slavery, there were individuals who experienced, even my own ancestors, who experienced their children being ripped away from them and sold into, I don't know why I did that, and sold into another plantation, and they were never able to see their children again, right? And then I can come back years later and see how there's an overrepresentation of Black children and child welfare and foster care, right? And I can look at the individual who moves differently with their Black child than a person who is not, a Black American and a descendant of the antebellum slave period and the ancestors who experienced that. And we can tie and connect the patterns. I think the behavior speaks for itself, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. We have a chat question I'm going to put up on the screen. The question is, what is an example of what research has shown in terms of how to adapt therapy for the BIPOC or QT-BIPOC communities?
So I am so glad that this person asked that. Chad, thank you for asking. The sad and most depressing part of this is that there's just not enough research that is out there to really, I mean, we really are just acknowledging racial trauma as a thing, within the past 10 years, right? Where we're really saying, okay, this is something that we need to work on, right? I cannot tell you what is evidence based because there's not enough research that's out about it. But what I can tell you is there has to be uh, work that works on helping the individual to acknowledge how the trauma, how the ancestral trauma, the intergenerational trauma, how we have been indoctrinated, how colonization has created these beliefs. That has to be acknowledged. That person has to acknowledge that, reconnect to their ancestral roots, like take all of those thoughts out. And this is in alignment with CBT, right? But just a different version of CBT, because cognitive behavioral therapy says what you believe about yourself, your internal thoughts and beliefs, it impacts the way you feel, ultimately the way you move, and then the consequences of that behavior, right? And so by helping individuals to recognize ways in which they were indoctrinated to have these internalized hatred and self-defeating behaviors, and to recognize where you do not have to buy into that. You don't have to touch and agree on those beliefs, and give them the platform to reconnect to their true and authentic self, their true and authentic identity, and reconnect to their ancestral roots. The job is to reconnect to the identity that was stolen. When we look at the example that I gave of Kuta Kinte, who finally breathed Toby out of survival, right? We want him to reconnect to Kuta Kinte and who he truly was. Does that make sense?
Let's see if the commenter adds a
I hope
comment,
I answered
I
that.
will make sure to display it. So, on that topic, especially in the age of the rise of the better helps and the online therapy, where you can check a box that says, yes, I am informed in all of these and I put this into my therapy practice, but you don't actually have to show a lot of evidence that you're doing so. What are some green flags that you would look for in either therapy or just generally trauma informed spaces that indicate that the person who set up the space is actually aware of the context that they need to be to adequately serve Black and Brown people?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I can, as you can imagine, I am not a fan of any of these platforms. These platforms are all created with the idea of profit in mind, right? And true therapeutic work. And we're not saying then that, no, you should work for pennies or anything like that. But what's driving, what is the motivating factor in these practices, right? And so we have to understand that I teach each and every person, you are doing the hiring, right? Vet these people out, do a consultation, and ask them, what does treating a person that is Black or brown look like to you? What are the strategies that you use? How do you practice, right? What does cultural responsiveness look like to you, right? How would you handle this situation? You want to vet the clinician. Don't just jump into the chair of anybody who's willing to give you a chance, or anybody who has availability, right? Because this is so important on your journey to healing. And one of the things that scares me the most is those who are not trained and not able to adequately render this type of care to a population who already has been hands off of therapy, that's finally, built up enough courage to say, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go to therapy, and it has a horrible experience, and one that reinforces the very trauma that they experience outside of that therapy room, right? I think that it should be taken very serious. The same way, like if you had a medical ailment, or if you had some serious surgery that was coming up, that you shouldn't just jump to the first surgeon who wants to do surgery. We want to vet these people out. Are you capable of doing what I need you to do, right? And the biggest thing is to know what you're looking for. I'd write a lot about this. So on our website, there's a blog, and I do a lot of writing to help people of color get to understand what the process of therapy is for and what you should be looking for, and to self-empower yourself by saying, study up on the different treatment modalities. What are the things that you think will best resonate with you? What do you think won't work for you? Green flags are a clinician who acknowledges that if they're not a person of color, even if they are a person of color, that they're going to do their best to watch for their own implicit and inherent biases, that they're going to do the best to respect the space as your space and allow you to lead when it comes to culture and teaching, and helping the clinician to understand what your cultural background is and how that impacts your own mental health, and a person that's not afraid to have those type of conversations, right? Because I read in a book somewhere, I think Michael Dyson wrote it, but he said, if we refuse to acknowledge that the devil exists, that's when he's most powerful, right? And it was very symbolic, right? So those who are unafraid to have that conversation in the first place, that's a green flag, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. And then we are coming to the end of time, but I would like to end on one final question. So, for anyone who's watching this webinar, who will eventually watch it, who is considering digging deeper into a healing journey for themselves, no matter where they are in that process, what advice would you give to them moving forward?
Number one, celebrate yourself, right? Like, just the fact, just acknowledging, you know what, I'm going to start this journey. I acknowledge the need to start this journey. That is one of the most biggest important steps on your journey to healing, right? Is the acknowledgement of it. And give yourself grace and mercy, right? You're working to unpack and heal from generations, hundreds of years of trauma. That's why I put that slide in there that showed the different multiple layers of trauma that you're working through, right? Your individual healing is collective. When you heal, just like trauma impacts and spreads those around you, so does healing. And so when you decide that I'm going to start this journey to healing, oh my, that is a huge thing, right? And so give yourself grace during that process. Know that it's not going to be, it's good. You're going to have great revelations, and you're going to have times where you feel like you want to quit, but honor yourself at every part of the journey and know that the journey within itself is more important than the destination.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off for the evening?
Just thank you for having me. I'm so glad. Thank you for
And
having
please plug yourself if you want to plug any work that you're doing or anything coming up.
Absolutely, yes. So we do a lot of work at the Urban Institute of Mental Health, consultation for clinicians who would like to be mentored on how to do this work. And we do clinical supervision. We do, of course, mental health therapy. And we have a team of clinicians that we work with. Once again, the practice is called the Urban Institute of Mental Health. We are mainly telehealth right now, so we serve all over the state of Maryland. The website is www.urbanmh.com.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended this evening. As a special treat, you get a sneak peek into what we're doing next week. I'm happy to announce that in honor of International Youth Day, the OHRE will be having our first ever youth takeover. So starting on Friday, they're kicking me out, and next week will be all run by youth of Howard County. So please turn in next week for our upcoming webinar where our youth will be talking about period equity, period stigma, and period poverty. Thank you so much, Octavia, for joining us this evening.